The reservation was for 7 o'clock, table for 2, corner spot near the window, the kind you have to request 3 weeks in advance at that particular restaurant. I had requested it 5 weeks in advance because I knew how fast they booked up on Fridays, and because 18 years felt like it deserved a corner table near the window. I had the card in my jacket pocket, not a card from the grocery store rack, one I ordered online, heavy paper stock, the kind where the envelope feels substantial in your hand. Inside I had written 4 sentences. I rewrote them 11 times before I was satisfied. 18 years and I still wanted to get it right. I was at the table by 6:50. The waiter brought water. I told him my wife was on her way. He nodded like that was a perfectly normal thing to say, and it was because it was supposed to be true. Her first text came at 6:44, before I even sat down. Running a little behind, project ran over. Give me 20 minutes. I didn't panic. She worked in project management for a mid-sized logistics firm. Deadline slipped. I texted back a single word, no rush, and meant it. I ordered a sparkling water and looked at the menu, even though I already knew what I was ordering. 7:15 came. I texted, still on your way? 3 dots appeared. Then, almost there, so sorry, 10 more minutes. I told myself the traffic on that side of downtown was unpredictable on Fridays. I told myself that was probably true. I looked at the other tables, couples leaning toward each other, a birthday group in the back corner, a man eating alone with his phone propped against the breadbasket. I didn't want to be the man eating alone, so I kept my phone face down and watched the door. 7:40 came. No text, no call. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording sounded bright and professional, the voice she used for work contacts. I didn't leave a message. I texted instead, everything okay?
The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Yes, so sorry, still wrapping up. This project is a nightmare. Don't wait on me, go ahead and order. I'll be there soon. I ordered the bread, I did not order food. I told the waiter we'd order together when my wife arrived, and he smiled with the kind of patience that told me he had seen this before and wasn't going to make it worse by acknowledging it. 8 o'clock came. I had been sitting at that table for over an hour. The card was still in my jacket pocket. The candle between the place settings had burned down a third of the way. I picked up my phone and looked at our text thread. 18 years of a marriage, and its entire visible history in that moment was me asking where she was and her telling me almost. That was when something shifted. Not suspicion, exactly. Not yet. It was quieter than that. It was the particular stillness that comes when your mind knows something your chest hasn't admitted yet. I had felt it once before in my life, years ago, sitting in a hospital waiting room while a doctor took too long to come back. That same quality of air, that same sense that the version of events you were still holding on to was already gone, and you just hadn't been told. I set the card on the table in front of me. I looked at it for a moment, then I put it back in my pocket, stood up, thanked the waiter, left enough cash to cover the water and the bread and a generous tip, and walked out. I didn't know yet where she actually was, but I knew she wasn't at the office. We met when I was 26, she was 24, working at a small event planning company, and I was doing mid-level project coordination for a construction firm that has since been bought out twice and no longer exists under the name I knew it by. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party.
She was standing near the kitchen counter with a glass of wine, explaining to someone why the appetizer layout was inefficient, and I found that specific combination, the confidence, the precision, the slight humor underneath it, immediately interesting. We dated for 2 years, got engaged on a Tuesday, which she always found funny because it was so unromantic in timing, though I had planned it carefully and the day of the week was accidental. Married at 28 and 26. Small ceremony, 60 people. Her mother cried. My father gave a toast that was too long, but genuinely kind. The early years were good, in the way that early years often are. Not perfect, but oriented toward each other. We made decisions together. We argued about real things and resolved them. We bought a house at 32 and spent a year making it ours in this specific, cumulative way that 2 people do when they're building something they intend to keep. We didn't have children. That wasn't a wound. It was a choice we made together, revisited twice, and arrived at the same place both times. Our life had a different shape than some of our friends' lives. More travel in our 30s, more quiet on weekends. A dynamic that stayed, by design, focused on the 2 of us. That focus, I think, is part of why the drift was so disorienting when it finally arrived. Because for the first 12 or 13 years, the attention between us felt mutual, not constant. We had careers, separate interests, individual friendships, but there was a baseline current, a consistent sense that we were each other's primary person, and that both of us knew it and acted accordingly. I can't identify a single moment when that changed. That's the honest answer. There was no fight that crossed a line, no single decision that fractured things. It was more like a slow pressure drop, the kind you don't notice until you realize you've been breathing shallower for a long time.
She got a promotion around year 14. Senior project manager, larger accounts, more travel, more evening calls. I was genuinely proud of her. I adjusted. I cooked more, managed more of the household logistics, built my schedule around her increased demands without resentment, because that's what you do when your partner is building something and needs the space to do it. But the adjustment was only ever one direction. I noticed that, eventually. Not bitterly at first, practically. I would mention something I needed, something personal or professional, and the conversation would somehow redirect back to her current workload, her current stress, her current whatever was pressing. I started keeping certain things to myself, not because I wanted to, but because the space to say them had gradually closed. By year 16, I had become, without either of us formally deciding it, the person who held things together in the background, reliable, steady, present. All qualities that sound like compliments until you realize they've become invisible. She still told people we were solid. I heard her do it at a dinner party 2 years before the anniversary that started this story. Someone asked how we were doing, and she said, without hesitation, that we were great, that I was the most stable person she'd ever known, that she didn't know what she'd do without me. I remember thinking, standing 4 feet away, holding a drink, that she had just described a utility. I didn't say that. I smiled. I refilled my glass. That moment didn't break anything, but I've thought about it since, and I think it was the clearest early signal, not of betrayal, not yet, but of a fundamental reframe. I had moved in her internal accounting from partner to infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't get anniversary dinners planned for it. Infrastructure waits at the table. The first thing I noticed was the phone, not in a dramatic way.
She didn't suddenly start hiding it under pillows or taking it into the bathroom for long stretches. It was subtler than that, which made it harder to name. She just became more attentive to it, the way you are when you're expecting something, a low-level alertness that hadn't been there before. She had always been someone who left her phone on the kitchen counter, face up, unconcerned. We weren't the type of couple who monitored each other. We had no reason to be. So when I noticed she had started placing it face down, consistently, in every room, I filed it under habit change and moved on. That was around 8 months before the anniversary. 6 months before, the late evenings started. She had always worked late occasionally. The promotion had made that more frequent, and I had normalized it. But there's a difference between working late because a deadline is pressing and working late as a default pattern, with no specific project attached to it. I started to notice that the late nights weren't tied to anything she mentioned. No upcoming presentations, no client crises she referenced the next morning, just late. Home at 9, sometimes 10, with the slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind was still elsewhere. I asked once, casually. She said a new account was demanding. I nodded. I didn't push. 5 months before, the emotional texture of our weekends changed. This one is harder to quantify, but I've thought about it enough that I can describe it accurately. She became less present at home, without being absent in any way I could point to. She was physically there, on the couch, at the table, in the same rooms I was in, but the quality of attention was different. When I spoke, she would respond correctly, appropriately, but half a beat late, like someone who's listening to 2 things at once and giving you the lesser portion. I told myself she was tired, stressed, carrying a lot. I was not wrong about any of those things.
I was wrong about them being the full explanation. 4 months before she started the gym, that alone meant nothing. People start the gym. She had talked about getting back into a routine for over a year, and I was supportive when she finally did. But the gym became 5 mornings a week almost immediately, which was aggressive for someone restarting a habit. And she came home from those mornings looking less like someone who had just worked out and more like someone who had taken care with how they looked before leaving the house. I noticed. I told myself I was being ungenerous. 3 months before, a name started appearing. Not in any incriminating way, just in conversation. A colleague, someone on a project she was running. She mentioned him the way you mention anyone you work closely with, naturally, in context, without emphasis, except that he kept appearing. Different stories, different situations, the same name resurfacing, with a regularity that, in retrospect, had its own kind of pattern. I didn't react to the name. I had no reason to, or told myself I didn't. 2 months before, she canceled our standing Saturday dinner. We had kept a version of date night for most of our marriage. It had evolved over the years, sometimes elaborate, often simple, but it existed as a consistent structure, a held space. She canceled it in month 16 of whatever was quietly happening, citing exhaustion, and we never formally reinstated it. I let that go too easily. I know that now. 1 month before the anniversary, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I started paying attention to her stories. Not suspiciously, not accusatorily, but with the specific focus of someone who is trying to determine whether 2 versions of the same account match each other, whether the timeline she gave Tuesday lined up with the detail she added Thursday, whether the colleague she mentioned being in a meeting with was the same one she'd said was traveling that week.
They didn't always line up. I didn't confront her. I wasn't certain. And there's a specific kind of reluctance that comes not from weakness, but from knowing that once you say the thing out loud, the version of your life that existed before you said it is permanently gone. So I stayed quiet, and I made an anniversary reservation, because some part of me, even then, was still hoping I was wrong. I got home from the restaurant at 8:30. The house was quiet, in the way it only is when you're the only one in it. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. I set my keys on the counter, loosened my jacket, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, not doing anything in particular. The card was still in my pocket. I took it out and set it on the counter next to the keys, and looked at it. Then I went to the living room and sat down. I wasn't ready to call her again. I didn't have the language yet for what I wanted to say, and I've learned over the years that conversations that matter should not be started before you know what you're actually trying to accomplish. So I sat. I turned on the television without sound. I watched it without seeing it. The iPad was on the coffee table. We shared it loosely. It was technically mine, bought for travel, but she used it at home when her laptop was charging or when she wanted a larger screen. Her Apple account and mine were separate, but she had a few apps logged into her own accounts on it. Messaging wasn't one of them, as far as I knew. I reached for it out of pure restlessness. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be precise about that because it matters to how I understood what happened next. I wasn't snooping. I was sitting in my living room, on my anniversary, alone, reaching for the closest object. I opened it. The screen came to life. There was a notification on the home screen, a preview from a messaging app I didn't recognize the icon of. Something third party, not the standard one.
She must have downloaded it at some point and stayed logged in without realizing it, or without thinking it mattered. The preview was enough. I won't write out the exact words, not because they're too painful, though they were, but because the specific language isn't what mattered. What mattered was the content. Someone, a name I recognized, had sent her a message asking where she was, followed by a second message that included the name of a bar. A specific bar, downtown, one I knew by name, maybe 10 minutes from the restaurant where I had just spent 90 minutes waiting for her. The timestamp on the notification was 7:52. While I was sitting at that table, while the candle burned down, while I was reading her texts telling me she was still at the office, wrapping up, almost there. I sat with the iPad in my hands and read the preview 3 times. The third time I read it, something in me went very still. Not the stillness of shock, exactly, more like the stillness of a thing clicking into place. The phone face down on every counter, the gym mornings, the name in conversation, the canceled Saturdays, the stories that didn't quite line up. Each one had been a piece I'd held separately, carefully,
telling myself there was an innocent arrangement I wasn't seeing yet. There was no innocent arrangement. I sat the iPad back on the coffee table. I sat there for a moment longer. Then I stood up, put my jacket back on, picked up my keys, and left the house. I knew the bar. I knew the neighborhood. I knew where to park. The drive took 9 minutes. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say, because I still didn't know if I was going to say anything at all. I just drove, with the particular focus of someone who has decided that whatever they are about to see, they need to see it directly. No more secondhand information. No more giving the benefit of a doubt I no longer had.
I pulled into a parking spot half a block from the entrance. I turned off the engine. I sat there for about 30 seconds. Then I got out of the car. The bar was the kind of place that looks casual from the outside and charges $14 for a cocktail once you're in. Exposed brick, warm lighting, the kind of ambient noise that makes every conversation feel private even when the room is full. I had been inside once before, years ago, for a colleague's going-away drinks. I remembered the layout: long bar on the left, tables running along the right wall, a back section that opened up into a wider seating area with lower lighting. I pushed the door open and walked in. Nobody looked up. That's the thing about walking into a bar alone on a Friday night. You are completely unremarkable. I was a man in a jacket coming in from the street. I took 3 steps inside and stopped, letting my eyes adjust, scanning the room the way you do when you're looking for someone without wanting to appear to be looking for someone. I found her in about 15 seconds. She was in the back section, the lower lit area, sitting across from a man I had never seen in person, but whose name I had heard enough times over the past 3 months to recognize it the moment she had first said it naturally in conversation. He was her height sitting down, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 40s. He was leaning forward with both forearms on the table, and she was leaning forward too, and the geometry of it, the angle of their bodies toward each other, the closed, private shape they made together, told me everything I needed to know before I heard a single word. She was laughing. That was the detail that landed hardest. Not the proximity, not the body language. The laugh. I knew that laugh. It was the one that meant she was fully present, fully comfortable, fully engaged.
I had not seen that laugh directed at me in longer than I wanted to calculate, standing in the doorway of a bar on our anniversary. She hadn't touched her drink. It sat to the side, slightly forgotten. Her phone was on the table, face up. I stood there for a moment, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15, long enough to be certain of what I was seeing, long enough for the last version of maybe I'm wrong to leave my body completely. Then I walked toward the bat section. I wasn't moving quickly. I wasn't moving with visible anger. I was moving at the same pace I would cross any room, which I think is what kept her from noticing me until I was close enough that looking away wasn't an option. She saw me when I was about 8 feet away. I watched it happen in her face, the laugh stopping mid-breath, the color shifting, the particular frozen quality of someone whose 2 separate worlds have just walked toward each other and there is nothing left to do but wait for the collision. She said my name, not as a greeting, as a thing said in the absence of anything else to say. The man turned to look at me. His expression moved through several things quickly: confusion, recognition, and then a careful blankness that told me he was not entirely surprised this moment existed, only that it was happening now. I stopped at the edge of their table. I looked at her. I looked at him. I looked back at her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform anything. I just stood there in the specific silence of a man who has already done the calculating and is no longer in the part of this where emotions are the loudest thing in the room. I said, "Happy anniversary." 2 words, quiet enough that only the 3 of us heard them. Then I pulled out the chair at the end of the table, the one that completed their 2-person setup into a 3-person one, and I sat down. Nobody spoke for a moment. The bar moved around us the way it had been moving. Glasses, voices, the low current of a Friday night crowd.
None of it touched our table. The 3 of us sat in a pocket of something completely separate from the room we were physically inside. She broke first. "What are you doing here?" The question came out wrong, and she knew it immediately. I could see her recalibrate, the slight wince, the recognition that those 4 words had just confirmed everything my presence already implied. She tried again. "I mean, how did you—" "It doesn't matter how," I said.
My voice was level. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strength, exactly. It was more that the anger I might have expected to feel had been replaced by something colder and more clarifying. I wasn't calm because I wasn't hurt. I was calm because I was operating in a register beyond the immediate emotion, in the part of the mind that takes over when the situation requires it. I looked at the man across from her. "I know your name," I said. "You don't need to introduce yourself." He nodded once, said nothing. He had the sense, at least, to understand that nothing he could contribute to this moment would improve it. I turned back to her. 18 years, I said. Tonight. She opened her mouth, closed it. I had a reservation, I said. Corner table. I was there from 6:50. I sat there for over an hour. I ordered bread. I paused. I had a card in my pocket. I rewrote it 11 times. Her eyes were filling. I registered that without moving toward it. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," I said. "I'm saying it so that the full picture of tonight is on the table. Because I think you may have told yourself a version of this, where the impact on me was manageable. I want you to know it wasn't." The man shifted in his seat, not standing, not speaking, just the physical discomfort of someone who wants to be anywhere else and knows he has no right to leave. She said my name again. This time it carried something. The beginning of an explanation, or an apology, or both collapsed together. I held up one hand.
Not aggressively. Just stop. Not here, I said. Not in front of him. Whatever you want to say to me, you say it at home. I stood up. I looked at him one final time. He met my eyes, briefly, then looked at the table. I took the card out of my jacket pocket and set it down on the table between them. Still sealed, still unopened. I hadn't planned to do that. It happened as a decision in the moment, and it was the right one. Not as a performance for the room, as a precise communication to her about what tonight had actually cost. Then I turned and walked back through the bar. I passed the long counter, the exposed brick, the Friday night crowd that had no idea what had just happened 6 feet from where they were standing. I pushed through the front door and walked to my car. I sat inside it for a moment. Through the windshield, the street looked exactly the same as it had 9 minutes ago when I parked. Same lights, same people moving past. The city entirely indifferent. I drove home. She was home 20 minutes after I was. I heard the front door open, her keys on the counter, the same spot she always put them, the ordinary sound of an ordinary return, except that nothing about it was ordinary. I was sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water I hadn't touched. I didn't move when she came in. She stood in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen. She had been crying. Her eyes were red at the edges, her composure mostly reconstructed, but not completely. She was holding her phone with both hands in front of her, the way people hold things when they don't know what to do with their hands. I looked at her and waited. "I don't know where to start," she said. "Then don't start yet," I said. "Sit down." She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten thousands of meals, where we had paid bills and planned trips and had the kind of low-stakes arguments that marriages are made of.
It looked the same as it always had and felt completely different. She started to speak twice and stopped both times. Then she said, "It wasn't supposed to be tonight." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. "That's what you want to lead with," I said, not a question. She closed her eyes briefly. "I mean, I knew it was our anniversary. I wasn't trying to. It wasn't a statement. It just, things got complicated this week and I made a bad decision and I know how this looks." "It looks like what it is," I said. She didn't argue that. What followed was not a confession in the complete sense. It was a partial accounting, offered carefully, shaped by the instinct to limit damage. She said it had been going on for about 4 months. She said it hadn't been planned, that it had developed gradually out of a working relationship. She said she had been trying to end it. She said tonight was supposed to be that conversation. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" The pause before her answer was long enough to be its own answer. "I don't know," she said finally. "I told myself I would once it was over, that if I ended it first, then maybe it wouldn't count," I said. She looked at the table. I stood up and refilled my water glass at the sink,
more to move than because I wanted water. I stood with my back to her for a moment. "I'm not going to scream at you," I said. "I'm not going to break anything. That's not who I am, and it wouldn't change what happened." I turned around. "But I need you to understand something. The issue isn't just what you did. The issue is the 18 months of small decisions that made it possible. The distance, the closed-off conversations, the way I became someone you managed instead of someone you talked to." She was crying again, quietly. "I know," she said. "I don't think you do yet," I said. "I think right now you're sorry it came out."
That's not the same thing. I picked up my water glass. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight," I said. "We'll talk more when we can do it without it just being damage control." I walked down the hall. The house was completely silent behind me. I went to work on Monday like nothing had happened. That was a deliberate choice. Not denial, strategy. I had learned early in my career that the moments when you most want to visibly fall apart are precisely the moments when staying composed gives you the most leverage over the situation, over yourself. I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, and until I wasn't going to let the crisis set the pace. She was still in the house. We had not discussed whether that was temporary or otherwise. She was using the master bedroom. I was in the guest room. We moved around each other with the careful, exhausting politeness of two people who have said something enormous and are now figuring out what comes next. We made coffee at different times. We ate at different times. We said the minimum necessary words and nothing more. She tried twice in the first 3 days to start a real conversation. The first time I told her I wasn't ready. The second time I told her the same thing, and I could see the frustration underneath her compliance, the instinct to resolve, to manage, to move the situation toward a conclusion she could live with. That instinct was not about us. It was about her discomfort with unresolved things. I recognized it clearly, and I did not accommodate it. On Tuesday, I called a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer specifically, a family law attorney a colleague had used 2 years prior and described as precise and unsentimental, which was exactly what I needed. I didn't walk in announcing I wanted a divorce. I walked in wanting to understand my position, what 18 years of marriage looked like legally.
What the house meant, what our finances meant, what my options were if I decided to leave, and what they were if I decided to stay. The attorney was exactly as described. She laid out the landscape without editorializing. I took notes. I left with a clearer picture of the practical reality beneath the emotional one. Knowing my position changed something in me, not toward anger, toward steadiness. There is a specific kind of anxiety that comes from feeling trapped inside a situation you don't understand, and a specific kind of calm that comes from understanding it fully, even when it's painful. I was operating in the second mode now. She didn't know I had seen the lawyer. I wasn't hiding it maliciously. I simply wasn't ready to use that information as a confrontation. I wanted to know the terrain before I decided which direction to move. Meanwhile, I watched, not obsessively, not with the frantic energy of someone collecting evidence for a case, but with the quiet attention of someone who has decided to be honest with himself about what he's actually seeing, rather than what he'd prefer to see. What I saw was managed remorse. She was sorry, I believed that, but the sorrow was consistently shaped around her own distress rather than mine. She cried when the situation felt overwhelming to her. She went quiet when I didn't respond the way she expected. She mentioned, once, that the uncertainty was really hard to live with, and I almost said something sharp, but didn't. I noticed she hadn't mentioned him again since that night. Not a word. Not a reference to whether it had ended, whether she had contacted him, whether the conversation she claimed was supposed to happen that night had actually happened. That silence was information. On Friday, 1 week after the anniversary, I sat in my car in the parking garage at work and thought carefully about what I actually wanted. Not what I was supposed to want. Not what would look reasonable to other people. What I specifically wanted from the remainder of my life. The answer came without drama. I drove home. It wasn't the bar that ended the marriage. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect the ending to be the biggest moment, the confrontation, the revelation, the card left on the table. Those moments matter, but they're not where marriages actually end. Marriages end in smaller, quieter places, in the specific detail that makes continuation not just difficult, but dishonest. For me, it was a Sunday morning, 10 days after the anniversary.
I was in the kitchen making coffee. She came downstairs, and for a moment the scene looked entirely normal. 2 people in a house on a Sunday morning, the light coming through the window the way it always did, the familiar sounds of the coffee maker, the ordinary geometry of a shared life. She sat down at the table. She said, "I've been thinking. I want us to try counseling." I looked at her. "I think we owe it to 18 years, she said. "I think we owe it to ourselves to not just end it without trying." The words were right. The sentiment was reasonable. If I had heard them 2 weeks earlier, in a different version of this situation, they might have meant something. But I had spent 10 days watching carefully, and what I said next came not from anger, but from the specific clarity that only arrives when you've been honest with yourself long enough. "Have you ended it?" I asked. She held my gaze. "Yes." "When?" A pause, small but present. "Last week," she said. I nodded slowly. I poured my coffee. I stood at the counter with it and looked at her. "I don't think that's true," I said. Not an accusation delivered in heat, a conclusion delivered in calm. The difference matters. She started to respond, and I continued. "You haven't mentioned him once since that night."
Not to tell me it's done, not to tell me how that conversation went, not to give me any information I would need if I were actually a partner in this process. The only thing you've managed in 10 days is your own comfort level with the uncertainty. I paused. That's not someone who is trying to rebuild something. That's someone waiting to see which way it falls. The silence that followed was different from the silences we'd had all week. She didn't cry. She didn't deny it. She looked at the table for a long moment and then looked back at me with something in her face that was almost relief, the particular relief of someone who no longer has to maintain a version of events. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said quietly. "I know," I said. And I did. That was the thing. I wasn't surprised. I had known in the parking garage on Friday, sitting alone in my car, that this was where we were. I had simply needed to hear her confirm it. I set my coffee down. "I'm going to call the attorney this week," I said. "I'd like us to do this without it becoming a war. I don't want to damage you. I don't want to use what I know as a weapon. I just want to be honest about what this is." She nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't collapsing. There was something almost steadying about that, the sense that she was finally, at least, being real with me. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not just for what happened. For all of it. For a long time before it." I believed that. "I know," I said again. I picked up my coffee and walked to the living room. I sat in the chair by the window, my chair, the one I had always preferred, and looked out at the street. The same ordinary Sunday morning it had been 5 minutes ago. The same light, the same quiet. Just a completely different life beginning to take shape inside it. The divorce took 8 months. Not because it was hostile, it wasn't mostly, but because 18 years of a shared life is a substantial thing to untangle, even when both people are trying to be decent about it. The house was the hardest part, practically. We had built enough equity that neither of us could easily buy the other out, so we sold it. That process took 4 of the 8 months. I moved into a rental apartment 2 miles away while it was finalized. The apartment was smaller than anything I had lived in since my late 20s. I bought a bed, a couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. I kept it simple on purpose. I wasn't punishing myself. I was starting from a foundation rather than trying to recreate what I'd had. There's a difference, and maintaining that distinction mattered to me. She and I spoke when the process required it, civilly, without the charged undercurrent you might expect. I think we were both tired in a way that had moved past anger into something more like resignation, the particular exhaustion of 2 people who have finally stopped pretending and are now simply finishing what needs to be finished. I didn't hate her. I want to say that plainly, because I think it's important. What she did was a serious betrayal. The lying, specifically. Not just the affair, but the sustained daily management of deception across months. That was the part that left the deepest mark. Not the other man. The version of me she had constructed in her mind that made the deception feel justifiable. The version where I was stable enough to deceive, present enough to use, and invisible enough that the cost of lying to me felt low.
That version of me had to end, regardless of the marriage. I started therapy 4 months in, not crisis therapy, practical, forward-facing work with someone who helped me examine not just what had happened, but what I had allowed to quietly accumulate. The invisibility, the one-directional adjusting.
The way I had mistaken reliability for connection, and then been surprised when reliability alone wasn't enough to hold things together. I had contributed to the conditions, even if I hadn't caused the betrayal. Holding both of those things simultaneously, without collapsing into self-blame or deflecting into pure victimhood, was the actual work of that year. I came out of it knowing myself more precisely than I had at any point in the 18 years prior. That is not a small thing. Professionally, I was steady throughout. My work had always been where I functioned most clearly, and it remained that way. I was promoted 14 months after the anniversary. I mention that not as a trophy, but as evidence that the structure of a life can hold even when its center has shifted, if you are deliberate about how you carry it. I am 2 years out now. I live alone and find that I don't mind it the way I expected to. I have more space, physical and otherwise, than I have had in a long time. I have friendships I reinvested in. I have a clearer sense of what I need from other people and a lower tolerance for the slow erasure of that. I have not remarried. I have dated, carefully and without urgency. What I carry from the marriage isn't bitterness, it's specificity. I know now what I will accept and what I won't. I know the difference between being dependable and being invisible. I know that patience is a virtue until it becomes a habit of suppression, and that the decent impulse to give someone the benefit of the doubt can, if left unchecked, become a long practice of not trusting your own perception. The anniversary reservation was for a corner table near the window. I had requested it 5 weeks in advance because I wanted to get it right. I think about that sometimes, not with grief, but with a kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement.
That man in the restaurant, sitting alone with the candle burning down, rewriting a card 11 times because 18 years deserved to be said correctly. He wasn't wrong to try. He was just trying in the wrong direction, towards someone who had already left, in every way that mattered, long before she walked into that bar. The trying wasn't the mistake. Not knowing when to stop was. And now I know.